we live in now, jet travel, consumer society, the TV landscape, was laid down in the 1950s. I saw change around me in Britain in the mid-1950s when I began to write, and I thought, how can I reflect this accelerating change? Everything is sort of being transformed, and yet that wasn't reflected in the pages of the novels being written, in the 1950s. So I more or less had to start writing. There was nowhere else within the science fiction world then. Of course, SF then, as Kingsley Amis, to his credit, pointed out, was going through, I think, its sort of greatest and most serious period. When one thinks of, present-day science fiction, particularly as seen in the cinema, it's really fantasy of a very kind of lurid and over-the-top kind, invaded in part by horror fiction and by the occult fiction. I mean, it's almost totally mindless. I certainly began as a science fiction writer, but I haven't really written any science fiction since the late 60s. I mean, I don't consider novels like Crash or High Rise or Concrete Island to be science fiction. I mean, I'm very proud to have begun my career as an SF writer, because I still believe that science fiction is probably the authentic literature of the 20th century. I think it's the only form of fiction that has really responded to sort of technological and scientific change. I think it's the equivalent of the sort of folk tale of the 20th century. It has a sort of direct line to the unconscious. This is where sort of archaic myth surfaces in the form of, the scientific and technological imagination. Its influence has been enormous. It's, on advertising, fashion, film. So much of the landscape of the imagination these days is dominated by SF. Certainly film. I mean, if you look at a list of the most successful films ever made, probably 8 out of 9 of them are SF films. Most of Spielberg's, for example. One very important thing science fiction has done is to break down the rigid separation between various sort of media, between, say, film and the printed word. Science fiction elides that difference. You move almost seamlessly from the printed word into the film through the TV series in a way that doesn't happen with the mainstream novel.
You've spent much of your writing life, it seems, in Shepperton here, deepest suburbia, as a widowed father, bringing up your children, sending them to school each day, getting them dressed and getting them to university and so forth. And your explanations of these abnormal, extreme limit conditions of reality seems to proceed from have proceeded from an incredibly normal lifestyle. What has been the relationship between your inner world and the world of your writing life?
Well, I've tried to persuade people, I am normal, whatever the term means, or whatever its limits. I mean, people over the years, particularly since I wrote Crash, have come to see me here expecting a sort of miasma of drugs and child molesting, and they're amazed to find that I'm a whiskey and soda man. I brought up my 3 children, happy, very happy children. I had a golden retriever and a cat and a couple of gerbils and a pet rat. They found ordinary domesticity, but in a way, I'd like to think that proves my point. The fact that an apparently sort of sane and decent human being can manage to write a book like Crash and emerge unscathed.
Or the Atrocity Exhibition or something.
Or the Atrocity Exhibition and emerge unscathed, I think proves my point that, that I'm as much a technician as, say, a pathologist carrying out an autopsy who, may be up to his elbows in human gore, but at the end of the day hangs up his rubber apron and goes home to a happy family.
You're up to your elbows in psychic gore.
Right, during the day I'm up to my elbows in psychic gore because I'm trying to carry out a kind of forensic examination of, a small corner of, human condition. And I'm trying to do so as dispassionately as I can.
From The Man on the 99th Floor by J.G. Ballard. Mind draining, Forbes turned to the balcony, dry mouth sucking at the air. Numbly, he jumped up onto the balcony and poised on the narrow ledge like a diver, the streets swaying before his eyes. Below, the horns were silent again, and the traffic had resumed its flow. A knot of vehicles drawn up in the center of a small crowd by the edge of the pavement. For a few moments, he managed to resist. And then the current caught him, toppling him like a drifting spar.
One of the things that driving through Shepperton to get here, and it's a question I've really been burning to ask you, and it's not just Shepperton, but it's any interurban or suburban area. When you see the semi-detached house and the extensions and the paving stones, I just wondered what your reaction was to the Rose and Fred West scenario, because I know you've written about your fascination for Myra Hindley in the past. That seems to be the ultimate overturning of suburbia at the end of the 20th century. I mean, literally under the paving stones, the horror, the horror. I'm just interested, as a news event, how you, as a writer and as a thinker, reacted to that, because it challenges everyone to react.
With absolute horror. I mean, as in the case of Myra Hindley and Brady, or any of these psychopaths, particularly like those who prey on children. I don't know whether the Wests technically were living in suburbia. I think they were living quite close to the centre of Gloucester, but I may be wrong there. It doesn't. They were living in what looked like sort of typical terraced townhouses.
But they were DIYers, they were living
Right.
in the same detached house.
Well, I mean, that was the ultimate in DIY, wasn't it? That was sort of DIY death. I mean, they were running a sort of one-man or one-woman concentration camp there. It was nightmarish, but I don't think the climate at any given time produces people like Fred and Rosemary West. I think, the human aberrations that have always been thrown up. The real question is whether the sort of, advanced high-tech societies that we live in now make it easier for people like the Wests to carry out their little evil worlds. I'm not sure if they do. I mean, we are all under enormous surveillance these days. I mean, not just from closed-circuit TV cameras in the local shopping precinct, but there are huge numbers of agencies that are keeping watch on us.
From the Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard. Holding the wound under her left breast, Nurse Nagamatsu stepped across Webster's body and leaned against the bogey of the telescope pylon. Clearing her throat with an effort, she spat out the blood. The flecks of lung tissue speckled the bright ribbon of the rail. The bullet had broken 2 ribs and collapsed her left lung and lodged itself below her scapula. As her eyes faded, she caught a last glimpse of the white American car setting off across the tarmac apron beyond the control house, where the shells of the old bombers lay heaped together. She tried to pull the wig off her head, then fell sideways across the rail.
There's a list of topics and icons and people and personalities about which I've always wanted to find J.G. Ballard's opinion, so I'm just going to present a list of them to you. I'm going to ask you very unfairly to respond in as succinct and lucid a manner as possible.
Go ahead.
Princess Di.
The most beautiful woman in the world, without a doubt, who's lost her way, I think. But, I mean, I remember saying when I watched the royal wedding to friends that she came from a troubled background, and I wondered, what the future would hold. In fact, she's come out of it magnificently, and it's the House of Windsor around her which has collapsed into a sort of